Hello and welcome to our fireside, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee or, in our case, a steaming mug of Mrs. Hudson's excellent cocoa on a bitterly cold night. It was the 17th of December, 1896, and London lay buried beneath the heaviest snowfall in 30 years. 1. The Woman in White. It was the 17th of December, 1896, and London lay beneath a pall of snow such as I had not seen since the terrible winter of '81. The flakes fell thick and slow, as though the very heavens had decided to bury the city in cotton wool and silence. From our sitting-room window in Baker Street, the familiar thoroughfare had vanished. Only the blurred yellow eyes of the gas lamps showed that a street still existed. The cries of costermongers, the rattle of hansoms, the shrill whistle of the metropolitan trains, all were muffled into a strange, dreamlike hush. Even the roaring traffic of the Marylebone Road sounded no louder than the rustle of silk in a distant drawing-room. Sherlock Holmes sat hunched in his mouse-colored dressing gown before a fire that had sunk into dull red embers. 3 pipes had already gone cold in the ashtray beside him, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of his strongest shag. Upon the carpet lay the remains of half a dozen newspapers cut into ribbons by his scissors, and across the chemical table stood a formidable array of test tubes, retorts, and spirit lamps, for he had spent the morning attempting to isolate a particularly elusive alkaloid from the Javanese arrow poison known as upas. The experiment had failed, and my friend was in that mood of dangerous languor which in him so often precedes a storm. I had just closed my book, Stanley Weyman's latest romance, and was on the point of suggesting that we walk as far as the Turkish baths in Northumberland Avenue, when the bell below rang with a violence that made Mrs. Hudson's best china tremble upon the sideboard. A moment later, our landlady appeared in the doorway, her good-natured face pale, a few snowflakes still glittering upon her shawl. "If you please, sir," she said, addressing Holmes with the deference she always showed when she suspected something out of the common. "There is a lady below who insists upon seeing you at once. I told her it was past 10 and the weather bitter, but she would take no refusal. She is in a terrible taking, Mr. Holmes, fairly trembling, and her veil so thick with frost I could scarcely see her face." Holmes sprang from his chair with a swiftness that scattered pipe ash across the hearthrug. "A lady, Mrs. Hudson? In this weather and at this hour? Show her up immediately. Watson, the brandy, and poke the fire into something resembling life." I obeyed and had barely set the decanter upon the table when the door opened again to admit a figure that seemed to have stepped straight out of the storm. She was tall, and wrapped from head to foot in a long cloak of white fox fur that glistened with melting snow. A veil of white lace, heavy with rime, concealed her features, but even through it I could perceive the gleam of dark, brilliant eyes. Her gloved hands clutched a large muff of the same pale fur, and every breath she drew came in a little cloud of vapor, for the temperature in our sitting room, despite the fire, was scarcely above freezing. Holmes had already placed a chair close beside the hearth. With a gesture of old-world courtesy, he indicated it. "Pray be seated, madam, and warm yourself. You have evidently come through the storm on a matter of extreme urgency. Watson, a glass of brandy." She sank into the chair as though her limbs had lost their strength, but waved away the brandy with a motion of one trembling hand. For a moment she sat quite still, gathering herself, while the snow upon her cloak began to melt and run in tiny rivulets onto Mrs. Hudson's best Persian rug. Then with a sudden movement she threw back the veil. I confess that I drew in my breath sharply. The face revealed was one of extraordinary beauty, but it was beauty ravaged by terror and grief. The skin was of marble whiteness, the lips almost blue with cold, and the great dark eyes burned with a feverish intensity. A single diamond blazed at her throat, and beneath the fur hood her hair showed the deep auburn that is so often the accompaniment of a passionate temperament. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Her voice was low and rich, but it shook as though every word cost her an effort. "They told me at Scotland Yard that if any man in England could work miracles, it was you. I have come to beg for one." Holmes had resumed his own chair and now sat leaning forward, his thin, eager face lit by the firelight, his fingertips pressed together in the attitude that I knew so well. "Pray compose yourself, madam," he said gently. "You are now among friends, and in the presence of men who have some little experience of desperate situations. My friend Dr. Watson possesses not only medical skill but the strictest discretion. You may speak freely." She drew a long, shuddering breath. "My name is Evelyn Langley, Lady Arthur Langley. My husband is the 3rd Baron, though the title is little more than a courtesy now. The estates were swallowed long ago by mortgages and bad investments. 3 nights ago, on the 14th, he disappeared from our house in Grosvenor Square. He had attended the Duchess of Windermere's ball, returned a little after 11, and went straight to the library to write some letters. At 12:30, the butler locked up as usual and saw nothing amiss. In the morning, the back door leading to the garden was found ajar, and a single line of footprints led across the snow-covered lawn into the square. There they ceased utterly, as though the earth had opened and swallowed him. Holmes's eyes had narrowed to bright slits. "Continue," he said softly. "The police were summoned. Inspector Lestrade himself came. They dragged the Serpentine, searched every stable and mews for miles around, questioned every cabman who had been on the rank in Grosvenor Square that night. Nothing. Lord Arthur had simply vanished, taking with him neither coat nor hat, though the temperature stood at 12 degrees of frost." "And this afternoon?" prompted Holmes, for he had noticed the agitation with which she clutched her muff. "This afternoon," she repeated, and her voice sank to a whisper. "A small package was delivered to me by a commissionaire who refused to give his name. It was wrapped in white paper and tied with crimson cord. Inside—" She opened the muff and drew forth a little box. Her hands shook so violently that Holmes took it from her and cut the string with his pocket knife. Within, nestling upon cotton wool, lay a gentleman's gold cufflink, beautifully enameled with the Langley crest, a stag's head beneath a baron's coronet. Frozen to the link was a clot of dark blood and a few strands of auburn hair. "My husband's," she said in a voice that seemed to come from far away. "He has worn those links every day since our marriage, and with them came this." From the depths of the muff she produced a single sheet of common notepaper. Holmes took it to the lamp and held it to the light. The message was printed in coarse capital letters. "The snow will keep him until the emerald is returned. No police. £20,000 or he dies." Holmes read it aloud, then turned the paper over in his long, nervous fingers. He sniffed it delicately, held it to the firelight, and finally passed it to me. "You observe the paper is cheap, the sort sold by any stationer," he remarked. "The ink is Higgins' American blue-black, the pen a broad J-nib. The capitals are carefully formed, as though by one not accustomed to writing. And there is the very faintest trace of a scent, bitter almonds unless I am mistaken." Lady Langley stared at him with wide, horrified eyes. "Cyanide," she whispered. "Prussic acid, possibly. But let that pass for the moment. The reference to the emerald is clear?" She nodded. "The Langley emerald, a stone of 68 carats, almost flawless, cut in the Mughal fashion with a rose on the reverse. It has been in my husband's family since the days of Warren Hastings. It is kept in the library safe, and its value is incalculable." Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed. "One thing more. You spoke of footprints that ceased in the middle of the square. Were they deep, as though a man were running?" "Very deep, Mr. Holmes, and the stride was abnormally long. Lestrade said it looked as though he were fleeing for his life. And the back door, was it forced? No, it was simply unlatched from within. Holmes rose and began pacing the room with the quick, noiseless steps that I knew betokened intense excitement. "Lady Langley," he said at last, "you have done wisely in coming to me. The matter is grave, but not, I think, hopeless. The snow, which your husband's abductors evidently regard as their ally, may yet prove their undoing. Snow is the most excellent preserver of evidence known to man. Watson, my fur-lined coat and my warmest muffler. We shall require a four-wheeler, and the sooner we examine those footprints before the thaw sets in, the better." For the first time, a faint ray of hope appeared in the lady's eyes. "You will take the case?" "My dear madam," said Holmes with a smile that lit his keen, aquiline face like a lantern, "when a beautiful woman braves a London snowstorm at 10 o'clock at night to place in my hands a problem containing a frozen cufflink, a ransom note smelling of bitter almonds, and a disappearing baron, refusal is impossible. The game, as I believe I have remarked on previous occasions, is very much afoot and upon ice." Outside, the snow still fell in great soft flakes, blotting out the stars and turning London into a city of ghosts. Somewhere beneath that white shroud, a man's life hung in the balance, and already, in the keen brain of Sherlock Holmes, the first threads of the tangled skein were beginning to unravel. 2 footprints in the snow. The storm had ceased sometime after midnight, and when we stepped out from 221B, the world lay virgin white under a sky of frosted steel. A four-wheeler waited, its driver muffled to the eyes, the horse steaming gently in the cold. Lady Langley had insisted upon accompanying us, and she now sat opposite Holmes, her white furs drawn close, her face pale but composed. Holmes himself was wrapped in his long ulster and ear-flap traveling cap, a bull's-eye lantern in one hand and his favorite stick in the other. I carried my old service revolver, for in cases where £20,000 and a human life are concerned, one does not take unnecessary chances. The streets were almost deserted. Only the occasional constable, hunched against the wind, saluted as we passed. The snow lay a foot deep in Baker Street and deeper still in the squares, where the sweeps had not yet begun their work. Our wheels cut 2 dark ruts, and the horses' hooves rang sharp on the iron-hard ground beneath the softer covering. We reached Grosvenor Square a little before 1 o'clock. The great houses stood silent, their windows shuttered against the night, their porticos heaped with drifts. The Langley mansion, number 47, was ablaze with light. Evidently the household had not yet sought their beds. A constable guarded the steps, and at sight of us he came stiffly to attention. Inspector Lestrade met us in the marble hall, rubbing chilled hands together. His sharp ferret face looked more pinched than ever in the cold. "Thought you'd come, Mr. Holmes," he said with a jerk of the head toward the back of the house. "It's a queer business and no mistake. His lordship's valet is half out of his mind, and the butler swears the house was locked and barred as usual. This way." We passed through the silent corridors, past suits of armor that glimmered ghostly in the gaslight, and out by a green baize door into the garden at the rear. Here the snow lay untouched, save for one narrow path trodden by the police. A constable stood on duty with a lantern, and the yellow beam fell upon a single line of footprints that began at the garden door and stretched away across the lawn. Holmes dropped on one knee the moment we reached the snow, regardless of his trousers. He adjusted the lens of his pocket magnifier and began to crawl slowly along the trail like some keen-scented hound. I have seen him examine many a clue, but never with such absorbed intensity. Lady Langley stood a little apart, one gloved hand pressed to her lips, watching with wide, frightened eyes. "Size 9 boots," Holmes announced presently without looking up. "Made by Lobb of St. James's. Note the characteristic shaping of the toe cap. The right heel is worn down on the outer edge. Your husband, I believe, rode much with the 17th Lancers in his youth and still carries the cavalry seat. The nails are the regulation pattern, but one is missing from the left heel. See the deeper impression where the leather meets the snow." He crept on, measuring the stride with a tape from his pocket. "Observe the length, 38 inches in places. No man walks thus unless he is running desperately. And here," he paused where the prince crossed a flower bed. "The toe has dug deep. He stumbled and recovered himself. He was fleeing for his life." Lady Langley made a little sound in her throat. "But from whom?" she whispered. Holmes did not answer at once. He had reached the edge of the lawn where it opened upon the railed garden of the square. Here the prince ended abruptly as though the runner had taken wing. Beyond lay only the smooth, unmarked surface of the square itself. "Most instructive," murmured Holmes. He swept his lantern in a slow arc, and the light fell upon something I had not noticed before. A faint, almost obliterated depression beside the deeper prints of Lord Arthur. A narrower, lighter mark, the ghost of a woman's boot. Holmes bent closer, brushing the surface snow away with his gloved hand. A lady's boot, French heel, size 3, made by Hellstern of the Rue de la Paix. The impression is scarcely visible yet unmistakable. She followed him, and at a walking pace. "Curious, is it not, Lady Langley, that a woman should pursue your husband across the snow in evening slippers?" The color drained from her face. "That is impossible," she said faintly. "I was asleep in my room. My maid will bear witness that I retired at 11 and did not leave my bed." Holmes merely smiled and, producing a small envelope, carefully scraped into it a sample of the snow where the woman's footprint lay. "Snow preserves odors as well as impressions," he remarked. "We shall see what the sulfate of aniline test reveals when we return home. And now, Lestrade, the back door, if you please." The door in question opened from a stone passage directly into the garden. It was a heavy affair of oak studded with iron, and the lock showed no sign of tampering. The key hung upon a nail inside. "Locked by the butler at 12:30, said Lestrade. "He swears no one could have passed in or out without his knowledge." Holmes examined the snow immediately in front of the step. "No prints leading inward," he said. "Only outward. Lord Arthur opened this door himself and stepped into the night, yet he took neither coat nor hat. His evening cloak still hangs in the hall. A man does not voluntarily face 12 degrees of frost in pumps and dress clothes unless he is driven by some overmastering terror or compulsion." He stood for a moment in thought, then turned sharply to Lady Langley. "The library safe, where the emerald is kept. I must see it at once." As we followed him back through the silent house, the great clock on the stairs struck 2, its chime echoing mournfully through the empty corridors. Somewhere in the distance a dog howled, and the snow began to fall again softly, relentlessly, as though determined to bury every secret beneath its white shroud. 3. The house on Grosvenor Square. The interior of number 47 was precisely what one expects of a noble family living upon the remnant of its grandeur. Lofty ceilings, marble pillars, and a faint air of decay behind the magnificence. The electric light had been installed only in the entrance hall. Elsewhere, the old gaseliers still hissed softly, throwing trembling shadows across ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow us with cold disapproval. Servants hovered in the background like anxious ghosts, and the butler, a venerable personage named Gregson, conducted us to the library with the solemnity of a high priest leading strangers into the Holy of Holies. The room was large and somber, paneled in dark oak, with a massive fireplace in which a single log smoldered. Books rose in tiers to the ceiling, Above the mantel hung a full-length portrait of a fierce old man in the uniform of a colonel of the East India Company, doubtless the original acquirer of the emerald. At the far end stood the safe, a ponderous green-painted object by Chubb, let into the wall behind a false set of Gibbon's Decline and Fall. Holmes went straight to it. The heavy door stood ajar, revealing an empty interior lined with faded red velvet. "Opened with the correct combination, I see," he observed, running his finger along the dial. "No trace of force, no acid marks, no drill holes. The thief, or thieves, knew the sequence perfectly." "Lady Langley, you told me only 3 persons possessed that knowledge. Your husband, yourself, and—" She hesitated the merest fraction of a second. "My husband's half-brother, Captain Ralph Trevorrow. He visited the library often in the old days before the quarrel." "Ah, yes, the gentleman who was requested to leave his regiment under something of a cloud, and who has recently returned from India. Most instructive." He closed the safe door, spun the dial, and then knelt to examine the carpet with his lens. "Observe," he said, indicating a faint indentation in the thick pile. "The pressure marks of a heavy portmanteau or trunk dragged across the room toward the window. And here, see the mudflake, dark red, typical of the clay along the upper Thames at Richmond. Someone stood here quite recently, and he was agitated. The ash from his cigarette has fallen in a little pyramid instead of scattering. A Trichinopoly cheroot by the smell. Your husband smoked only Turkish, I believe?" Lady Langley inclined her head. Holmes crossed to the French windows that opened upon a small iron balcony overlooking the garden. The curtains were still drawn back exactly as they had been found on the morning of the disappearance. "From this balcony to the garden path is no more than 10 feet, he murmured. "A rope ladder, perhaps, or a desperate leap into soft snow. Yet no disturbance of the flower bed beneath. Curious." He opened the window. The cold night air swept in, carrying with it a few stray flakes. The balcony rail was thick with frozen snow, but upon the iron floor lay a single white object. A camellia half-crushed, its petals bruised and stained with a darker color. Holmes picked it up with delicate care. "Camellia japonica alba," he said softly. "Not a flower one expects to find in a London winter. The hothouses at Kew might produce such a bloom, or certain private conservatories. The staining is blood, recent and human. Someone stood here bleeding while he waited." Lady Langley stared at the flower as though it were a snake. "I detest camellias," she said in a low voice. "My husband knew it. He would never bring them into the house." Holmes placed the flower in an envelope and slipped it into his pocket without comment. We were interrupted by Gregson the butler, who entered bearing a salver upon which lay a visiting card. His old face was rigid with disapproval. "Captain Trevorrow is below, my lady. He insists upon seeing you. I informed him the house is in mourning and the police are present, but he will take no refusal." Lady Langley's gloved hand flew to her throat. "Show him up," said Holmes calmly before she could speak. "I have a great desire to meet the captain." A moment later the door opened to admit a tall, bronzed man of perhaps 35, dressed in a heavy astrakhan coat. He carried himself with a soldier's bearing, but there was something in the set of the jaw and the restless glitter of the eyes that spoke of a temper held in check by effort alone. The scar of an old saber cut ran from his left temple into the heavy mustache. "Evelyn," he began, "without preamble, I came the instant I heard." His glance fell upon Holmes and myself, and he stopped. "Captain Ralph Trevorrow, I presume," said Holmes pleasantly. "Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson. We are investigating your brother's disappearance at Lady Langley's request." Trevorrow's eyes narrowed. "I was not aware the family had called in private detectives," he said coldly. The official police are surely competent. Sometimes, replied Holmes with a smile, they require a little assistance. The captain ignored him and turned to Lady Langley. I have only just returned to town. My club forwarded the newspapers. If there is anything I can do, money, influence in India, anything, you have only to ask. His voice was sincere, yet I noticed that his gaze flickered continually toward the safe. That is most generous, said Holmes smoothly, especially in view of the unfortunate breach between the brothers. Tell me, Captain, when did you last see Lord Arthur? Trevorrow stiffened. 3 years ago in Calcutta we did not part on the best of terms. Yet you knew the combination of the library safe. For a moment the library was so silent that I could hear the ticking of the ormolu clock upon the mantel. I did not, said Trevorrow at last, very quietly. Strange, murmured Holmes. The safe was opened by someone who did, and only 3 people in England possessed that knowledge. Trevorrow's hand went to his mustache in a gesture that might have concealed a smile or a snarl. I fear you are mistaken, Mr. Holmes. There was a 4th. My brother's former valet, Merritt, discharged 6 months ago for drunkenness. He was in and out of this room daily for years. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Merritt, of course. A man with auburn hair and a slight cast in one eye? Thank you, Captain. You have been most helpful. Trevorrow bowed stiffly to Lady Langley and took his leave. As the door closed behind him, Holmes stood motionless, his head thrust forward like a bloodhound casting for the scent. The plot thickens, he said softly. Come, Watson. There is nothing more to be learned here tonight. But before we go, one last look at the portrait above the mantel. He stood gazing up at the fierce old colonel for a long minute. Observe the eyes, he murmured. The same restless brilliance we have just seen in the grandson. Family traits are remarkably persistent, are they not? Especially the less admirable ones. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again in earnest, and the wind moaned around the great house like a living thing. Somewhere in its labyrinth of rooms, a clock struck the half-hour, and I could not rid myself of the fancy that the old colonel in the portrait was listening. 4. The missing emerald. We returned to Baker Street as the first pale hint of dawn crept over the rooftops, turning the snow to a cold, lifeless blue. Holmes was in that state of suppressed excitement which told me the case had seized him utterly. He flung off his ulster, lit his oldest briar, and began pacing the room in his purple dressing gown like a caged tiger. Sit down, Watson, he said at last, and let us take stock. We have a vanished peer, an empty safe, a ransom note smelling faintly of prussic acid, footprints that end in mid-air, a crushed camellia stained with blood, and a half-brother lately returned from India under a cloud. The pieces are numerous, but they will fit. He threw himself into his armchair and stared into the dying fire. First, the emerald. I have spent the evening while you dozed in the cab reconstructing its history. The Langley stone was taken from the left eye of the goddess Kali in a temple near Srinagar in 1857 by Colonel Sir Henry Langley during the suppression of the mutiny. The priest who lost his eye with it placed the celebrated curse, "He who removes the heart of winter shall himself become winter, and all he loves shall perish in frost." Romantic twaddle, of course, but curses have a way of fulfilling themselves when greed provides the mechanism. He reached for a fat, red-covered volume from the shelf, his own indexed record of crime, and flipped the pages rapidly. Here we are, 1862. Colonel Langley found frozen to death in his library, windows open though the temperature was mild. 1881, the second Baron, having just inherited, disappeared while skating on the lake at Langley Chase. His body recovered in the spring thaw, still clutching the emerald. And now the third Baron vanishes in the worst December since '81 pattern, Watson, unmistakable pattern. I protested that coincidence was not causation, but Holmes waved me down. Next, Captain Ralph Trevorrow. I wired my homeless irregular in Aldershot this evening, reply received at midnight. He tossed a crumpled telegram across. It read, Trevorrow cashiered Simla July last. Suspected poisoning messmate prussic acid. Evidence insufficient, left for England September. Prussic acid again, murmured Holmes. The scent of bitter almonds on the ransom note was no accident. Trevorrow is familiar with the poison, he has used it before. Moreover, he is in the Trichinopoly cheroot ash in the library. The captain smokes nothing else. I observed the gold band still clinging to the stub in the grate. He sprang up and began rummaging among the chaos on the chemical table. Third point, the emerald itself. I took the liberty, while Lady Langley was speaking with Lestrade, of examining the safe's velvet lining under my lens. A single thread of green silk adhered to the hinge. Someone removed the stone from its case very recently. But here is the curiosity. The depression in the velvet is far too shallow. The Langley emerald is a thick Mughal rose cut almost 3/4 of an inch deep. The hollow left behind could only have been made by a stone half that thickness. He held up a small object between thumb and forefinger, a flat disc of green glass exquisitely cut to resemble the famous jewel. A paste replica, he said triumphantly. Made, I suspect, in Vienna. The cutting is characteristic. Someone substituted this sham for the real emerald months ago, perhaps years. Lord Arthur has been guarding an empty honor while the true stone was already in other hands. I stared at him, bewildered. Then the theft from the safe was pure theater. The safe was opened to convince us the emerald had only just been stolen. The ransom note is a blind. £20,000 would be welcome, but it is not the true object. The object is to make certain that everyone believes the emerald is still in circulation so that the real stone may be sold quietly abroad without suspicion falling upon the one person who has possessed it all along. He began filling his pipe with yesterday's dawdles from the Persian slipper. Consider the sequence. Some time ago, let us say 6 months, the genuine emerald disappears from the safe and is replaced with glass. The only people who ever see the stone are Lord Arthur and his wife. Both assume the other has removed it for cleaning or resetting. No alarm is raised. Then quite recently Captain Trevorrow returns to England. He has gambling debts in 3 continents and a taste for revenge. He discovers that the emerald he expected to inherit one day is already gone. He decides to punish his brother and line his own pockets at one stroke. Holmes struck a match and puffed furiously. He forges a series of letters in Lady Langley's handwriting. Easy enough. He has specimens from earlier years, suggesting that she intends to elope and sell the jewel. Lord Arthur already suspects his wife of coldness. The letters drive him half mad with jealousy and fear of scandal. On the night of the 14th, Trevorrow sends a final note. Meet me in the garden at midnight or the emerald goes to the Jews tomorrow. Lord Arthur, distracted, rushes out coatless into the snow. There he is overpowered, bound, and removed. The footprints end in the square because a closed carriage was waiting. The woman's print is Trevorrow himself wearing a pair of his sister-in-law's discarded boots to confuse the trail. But the cufflink and the blood, I objected. Taken from Lord Arthur during the struggle. The hair is his own. The blood is from a deliberate prick of the lancet, all arranged in advance. The ransom demand is a blind to keep us searching for a living kidnapper while the true crime, slow murder by cold, proceeds undisturbed. He leaned forward, the firelight dancing in his eager eyes. And the camellia, Watson, do not forget the camellia. White camellias are the emblem of the old Kashmir regiment in which both Colonel Langley and, later, Captain Trevorrow served. A message, perhaps, or a signature. Our man is not without a sense of drama. The clock on the mantel struck 5. Outside, the milk carts were beginning their rounds, their bells tinkling faintly through the muffled streets. Holmes rose and stretched his long limbs. Tomorrow, no, today, we have much to do. I must visit certain jewelers in Hatton Garden who deal in paste stones. You will go to Somerset House and search the marriage registers for any recent alliance that might explain a lady's evening boots in the snow. And both of us must keep our eyes open for a frozen corpse that is not quite what it seems. He stood at the window watching the slow lightening of the sky over the white roofs. Somewhere beneath this innocent snow, he said softly, a man is dying inch by inch, and a great stone burns like a coal of green fire in a murderer's pocket. We have perhaps 48 hours before the thaw sets in and every footprint, every clue is lost forever. After that, only the emerald will remain, cold, perfect, and accursed. He turned back to the room, and his voice rang with sudden decision. To work, Watson, to work. The coffee is cold, the pipes are foul, and London is waking under its white shroud. But somewhere in this frozen darkness a heart still beats, and while it beats we have a chance. He reached for his violin and drew the bow across the strings in a wild, improvised storm of notes, while the pale winter dawn crept across the sleeping city. 5. 3 telegrams and a funeral. The morning of the 18th broke clear and cruelly cold. A thin, hard sun glittered on the snow, turning every roof and railing into a blade of white fire. The streets rang with the scrape of shovels and the shouts of boys offering to sweep crossings for a penny. In Baker Street, the muffin man's bell sounded as usual, but the muffins themselves were frozen solid inside his tray, and he beat them together like cymbals to prove the fact. Holmes had not slept. When I came down at 8 o'clock, he was already dressed in his severest frock coat, a black band upon his sleeve in deference to the supposed death in Grosvenor Square. Upon the breakfast table lay 3 orange envelopes and a plate of congealed eggs which neither of us had touched. Read them in order, he said, pushing the telegrams toward me with the stem of his pipe. The first was timed 7:12 a.m., Scotland Yard, body of male, age approx 40, auburn hair found frozen in Thames ice below Richmond Bridge, evening dress, no marks of violence, cufflinks bear Langley crest, awaiting identification at mortuary Lestrade. Captain Trevorrow called this morning offering every assistance. I refused to see him. The strain is terrible. E.L. The third timed 7:45 a.m. from Cox & Cohen, Charing Cross. Holmes's eyes glittered like ice itself. Observe the exquisite timing, he said. A corpse conveniently discovered the very morning after the ransom note. £20,000 withdrawn the day before the disappearance, ostensibly to pay the ransom, yet no ransom has been demanded in person. And the gallant captain paying a condolence call before the body is even cold. The curtain rises on the final act, Watson, and the villain is impatient for applause. He sprang up and began stuffing papers into a small dispatch case. We go to Richmond at once. Bring your revolver and the large lens, and tell Mrs. Hudson we shall want sandwiches. This promises to be a long day and possibly a longer night. The mortuary at Richmond stands upon the riverbank, a low brick building perpetually damp and smelling of carbolic and the Thames at low tide. The attendant, a phlegmatic man with frostbitten ears, led us down a stone passage to the slab room where the body lay beneath a sheet already stiff with rime. Lestrade was there before us, rubbing his hands together and blowing on his fingers. Thought you'd want to see for yourself, Mr. Holmes. It's his lordship to the life, poor gentleman. Been in the water 4 or 5 days, the doctor says. Face a bit swollen and discolored, but the hair and the height match. and these were in the pocket. He held up the pair of gold cufflinks, one still bearing the frozen clot of blood and hair. Holmes bent over the corpse with the silent intensity I knew so well. The dead man lay on his back, arms stiff at his sides, the features distorted by the action of frost and water. The lips were blue, the eyes half open, staring at the vaulted ceiling with a fixed and terrible stare. "Note the cyanosed lips," murmured Holmes, "and the faint odor of bitter almonds still perceptible despite the cold. Prussic acid injected, not swallowed. Observe the puncture at the base of the neck, almost hidden by the collar. Death would have been instantaneous." He lifted the rigid arm. "Rigor mortis fully established, but the limbs have been straightened after death. See the slight cracking of ice along the joints. Someone arranged the body decoratively before the river took it." He turned to the clothes, laid out upon a side table. Evening dress suit by Poole, linen from Paris, patent shoes scarcely scratched. In the tail pocket, a sodden card case still held a few visiting cards. Arthur St. John Langley, Baron Langley of Langley Chase. "Everything perfect," said Holmes softly. "Almost too perfect. And yet—" He took the dead man's right hand and examined the nails with his lens. No nicotine staining. Lord Arthur was a 20-a-day man. Egyptian cigarettes. These fingers have never held a cigarette in their life. And the scar, where's the scar on the second finger he got at polo in '89? Absent. Finally the hair, auburn certainly, but observe the roots. Dark. This man dyed his hair regularly. Lord Arthur's was naturally that color. Lestrade stared, open-mouthed. "You mean—" "I mean, Inspector, that someone has gone to considerable trouble to provide a convenient corpse. The real Lord Arthur still lives, for a few hours longer, perhaps. We must find where he is hidden, before the thaw or the poison finishes what the cold began." Holmes turned to the attendant. "When was the ice cut hereabouts?" "Last week, sir. The big houses take their ice from the reach above the bridge. Norwegian blocks mostly, but some local." Holmes's face lit with sudden excitement. "Ice houses, of course. Come, Watson, there is not a moment to lose." We left Lestrade still gaping and hurried out into the dazzling sunlight. The river lay sheeted in ice as far as the eye could reach, broken only by the dark scar where the body had been recovered. A line of men with poles and saws were already at work cutting fresh blocks for the great houses of London. Holmes stood upon the bank, scanning the opposite shore through his glass. Richmond, Teddington, Kingston. Every riverside mansion has its ice house. And the Langley House in Grosvenor Square possesses one of the oldest in London, built in 1792 and still in use. A perfect prison, Watson. Cold, silent and forgotten. Once the door is closed and the snow drifted over, no cry could penetrate those triple walls. He snapped the glass shut. We return to town. I must speak with Lady Langley before the captain pays another of his solicitous visits. And we have a funeral to arrange. The funeral of a man who is not dead, and the wake of a murderer who believes himself safe. The train back to Waterloo was crowded with clerks sliding about on the frozen platforms, their breath rising like steam from so many kettles. Holmes sat opposite me, his eyes half closed, his long fingers drumming silently upon his knee. "Picture the scene," he murmured. Trevorrow, needing a corpse that will pass at a distance, remembers Merritt, the discharged valet. Same height, same coloring, conveniently desperate for money. A meeting is arranged, a glass of drugged whiskey, a swift injection behind the ear. The body is dressed in Lord Arthur's clothes, taken from the house weeks earlier, the cufflink added for authenticity. Then, under cover of darkness, it is floated into the river just as the frost sets hard. By morning, it is locked in the ice, waiting to be discovered at the proper dramatic moment. And the £20,000? Insurance. If the ransom ruse succeeded, Trevorrow would collect it. If not, well, the money was already in his possession, withdrawn by Lord Arthur under threat days earlier. Either way, he wins. The train rattled over the points and the sun struck fire from the frozen river. But the real Lord Arthur? I said, where is he? Holmes looked at me for a long moment and his eyes were very bright. Somewhere very cold, Watson. Somewhere so cold that a man may be kept alive for days, yet unable to cry out or escape. And when we find him, we shall find the emerald also. The true emerald, not the paste bauble that has deceived us all. He leaned forward and his voice dropped to a whisper that only I could hear above the clatter of the wheels. The snow is our ally now. It preserves everything. Footprints, scents, even life itself for a little while. But the thaw is coming. Tonight, perhaps tomorrow. We have hours, not days. At Waterloo, we took a hansom and drove straight to Grosvenor Square through streets where the snow was already beginning to melt in dirty rivulets under the pale sun. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, slow and mournful, as though London itself were preparing for a funeral that had not yet begun. 6. The scent of bitter almonds. The afternoon had turned sullen, a low, iron-gray sky pressed upon the city like a coffin lid, and the thaw had begun in earnest. Water dripped from eaves and cornices. The snow in Grosvenor Square was already pocked and filthy, and every passing wheel flung up a brown spray. The great house wore black crape upon the knocker and mourning shutters at every window, though the corpse that lay in Richmond mortuary was not the man whose death it pretended to mourn. Lady Langley received us in the small morning room that looked upon the sodden garden. She was dressed in the deepest black, her face so pale that the violet shadows beneath her eyes seemed painted there by a cruel hand. When Holmes told her quietly and without preamble that the frozen body was not her husband's, she swayed and would have fallen had I not caught her arm. "Then Arthur still lives?" she whispered. "For a little longer, perhaps," Holmes replied. "But time is a luxury we do not possess. I must ask you some questions, painful though they be." He spoke with unusual gentleness, yet the questions were merciless. On the night of the 14th, had she written any note to her husband? No. Had she ever threatened to sell the emerald? Never. Did she possess a pair of evening boots with French heels, size 3? Yes, but they were in her dressing room untouched. Had she ever worn or received white camellias? She shuddered. Never. She detested them. Holmes listened, his eyes half closed, then asked to see Lord Arthur's dressing room. While Lady Langley waited below, we mounted the great staircase. The room was exactly as his lordship had left it. Dress clothes laid out upon the bed, the evening shirt still bearing the creases of the laundry, a half-smoked Egyptian cigarette in the ashtray. Holmes moved like a shadow, touching nothing, seeing everything. From a drawer he drew a small morocco case. Inside lay a second pair of cufflinks, identical to the blood-stained one save that they were clean. He held them to the light. "Observe," he murmured. "The enamel on the crest is slightly chipped on the left stag's antler. The link sent to Lady Langley had the identical chip. Therefore it came from this room, and recently." He crossed to the fireplace and stirred the ashes with a penknife. Among the gray dust glittered a tiny flake of green glass. "The paste emerald," he said softly. "Broken in, haste and burnt. The substitution was made here under Lord Arthur's very nose." Downstairs again he requested writing materials. Upon a sheet of the Grosvenor Square notepaper he printed in careful capitals, "Meet me at the old ice house on the river bank. Midnight. Come alone or the emerald is lost forever. E." He showed it to Lady Langley. She stared, then covered her face with her hands. "That is my handwriting," she said in a voice of horror. "Yet I swear I never wrote it." Holmes folded the note and placed it in his pocketbook. Captain Trevorrow is a forger of no mean skill, he said. He has studied your hand for years. This note lured Lord Arthur into the garden. The rest we know. He turned to the window. The garden was a mire of melting snow, but beneath the yew hedge the deeper drift still preserved a faint line of footprints, narrow, pointed, unmistakably a woman's. Those were made last night, Holmes said. While we were at Richmond, someone returned to the scene. The boots will be destroyed by now, but the scent lingers. He knelt, drew a crystal vial from his pocket, and with a glass rod transferred a drop of liquid from the footprint to the tube. A moment later he held it to his nose. Bitter almonds again, he said grimly. Trevorrow carries his signature with him. At 7 o'clock that evening we were back in Baker Street. Holmes spent an hour at the Telegraph and another closeted with a lady whose face I did not see, though I recognized the rustle of Violet Hunter's dress as she left. When he emerged, his eyes were bright with the old fighting light. "Everything is arranged," he said. "Tonight Miss Hunter, dressed and veiled exactly as Lady Langley was when she visited us, will keep the appointment at the ice house. You and I, Watson, will be close behind. Trevorrow believes the ransom is coming and the game is his. We shall show him otherwise." I protested that the risk was too great, but Holmes cut me short. "The real Lord Arthur has perhaps hours left. The ice house is the only place cold enough, hidden enough, and cruel enough for Trevorrow's purpose. He will come tonight to collect his money and to make certain his brother is past saving." He opened a drawer and took out his old service revolver. "Load yours also. Cyanide is swift, but a bullet is swifter." The rest of the evening passed in silence. Holmes sat before the fire, his violin across his knee, drawing from it slow, mournful notes that seemed to come from the heart of winter itself. Outside, the fog thickened and the temperature fell once more. The thaw had been only a cruel, false promise. At 11 o'clock, we extinguished the lights, slipped down the stairs, and took a hansom toward the river. The old Langley ice house stood upon a deserted reach of the Thames below Richmond. A low domed building half buried in the bank, its entrance choked with snow. Once it had supplied half Mayfair with ice for summer parties. Now it was forgotten, its iron-bound door rusted shut, its interior a cavern of darkness and frost. We left Miss Hunter at the entrance, a white figure against the blackness, and took up our positions behind a clump of alders 30 yards away. The fog rolled up from the river in slow, yellow coils. Somewhere a night bird cried once and was still. The minutes dragged like hours. At 20 minutes past 12, a shape detached itself from the mist, tall, astrakhan-coated, a glint of steel in the right hand. Captain Trevorrow. He moved quickly to the waiting woman. "Evelyn, you she-devil," he hissed. "You have the money and the emerald." Miss Hunter gave a muffled scream. Holmes and I sprang forward, but the fog betrayed us. Our boots crunched on frozen snow. Trevorrow whirled, pistol flashing. A tongue of flame split the darkness, and the bullet whined past my ear. Before he could fire again, Holmes was upon him. There was a brief, savage struggle, two tall men swaying together in the fog. Then the pistol spun away into the snow, and Trevorrow broke free, running toward the river. Holmes did not pursue. He stood listening. From the depths of the ice house came a sound, faint, almost inaudible, yet unmistakable. A low, continuous moaning, as of a man at the ultimate end of endurance. We seized the lantern and plunged inside. The air struck us like a blow from an iron fist. The temperature must have been 20 degrees below freezing. Great blocks of Norwegian ice rose on either side, glittering in the lantern light like the walls of an enchanted cavern. And in the center, suspended by the wrists from a butcher's hook driven into a beam, hung Lord Arthur Langley. He was naked save for his evening shirt and trousers, his body encrusted with frost, his auburn hair stiff with rime. His eyes were closed, his lips blue, but the faint moan still issued from his throat. In his right hand, clenched with the desperation of a dying man, blazed the true Langley emerald, green fire against the white death that surrounded him. Holmes cut him down with one sweep of his knife. I wrapped my overcoat about the half-frozen body and felt for the pulse, slow, flickering, but still there. "He lives," I said. "Barely." We carried him out into the fog. Of Captain Trevorrow there was no sign save footprints leading to the river's edge and a single white camellia crushed into the snow where he had stood. Somewhere in the darkness a church clock struck one. The hunt was not yet over, but the heart of winter had yielded up its prisoner, and the emerald burned once more in a living hand. 7, a waltz in the dark. Lord Arthur Langley did not die, though for 48 hours it hung upon the breadth of a hair. We carried him, stiff as a statue and glittering with frost, through the black streets to the house of a physician in Harley Street who owed Holmes more than one favor. There, wrapped in heated blankets, surrounded by hot water, bottles and mustard plasters, he slowly returned to the world of the living. His first coherent words, gasped between chattering teeth, were of the emerald. He would not release it, even when delirium seized him, and he raved of green fire and a woman dancing upon ice. Captain Ralph Trevorrow had vanished as completely as though the river had swallowed him. His lodgings in Half Moon Street were deserted. The bird had flown, leaving behind only a half-burned letter in the grate and a faint, lingering scent of bitter almonds. Lestrade set the whole of Scotland Yard upon the hunt. Yet I knew in my bones that until Holmes chose to move, Trevorrow would remain invisible. On the third evening after the rescue, I found Holmes in our sitting room. The gas turned low. A single candle burning beside a gramophone he had borrowed from Langham's hotel. Upon the table lay a white camellia and a glass of water, and the air was heavy with the strange, sweet scent of chloroform. Holmes was experimenting with the rate at which it evaporated in extreme cold. He looked up as I entered, his eyes bright and almost feverish. "Close the door, Watson. The stage is set for the final dance, and we must rehearse our steps." He lifted the needle and set it upon the revolving disc. A slow, lilting waltz filled the room, Lahar's gold and silver languorous and mocking. "Listen," he said. On the night of the Duchess of Windermere's ball, this was the last tune played before supper. Lord Arthur danced it with his wife. He is a man of rigid habit. Every year on their anniversary, he insists upon the same waltz, the same steps, the same turn at the third beat. Trevorrow knew that. He also knew that Lord Arthur, half mad with forged letters and jealousy, would obey any summons signed E that bade him meet his wife upon the ice. He stopped the machine and the silence rushed back. "Tonight," he continued, "Lady Langley will receive a final note, delivered by a commissionaire who will instantly disappear. It will beg her to come alone to the frozen lake in Hyde Park at midnight, bringing the emerald and the £20,000. The note will be in her own handwriting. Trevorrow still has the copying press he used before. She will, of course, bring neither money nor jewel, but she will come, veiled and cloaked exactly as she was when she first entered this room. And we, Watson, shall be waiting." I began to protest the danger, but Holmes silenced me with a gesture. "Trevorrow is wounded pride incarnate. He has lost his prisoner, his ransom, and his reputation. Only one thing remains: to punish the woman he believes betrayed both his brother and himself. He will come for her tonight, and when he does, the circle closes." At 11 o'clock, Lady Langley arrived, white-faced but steady. Violet Hunter had coached her in every gesture, every tilt of the head. She even wore the same white fox cloak, the fur now cleaned of its tragic journey, through the snow. Holmes handed her a small revolver, my old Adams, cleaned and freshly loaded. "If he is close enough for you to smell the bitter almonds," he said quietly, "shoot for the heart." We left separately. Lady Langley in a closed brougham, Holmes and I on foot, keeping to the shadows of Park Lane. The fog was thick again, the temperature plunging. The thaw had been a brief delusion, and the lake in Hyde Park lay once more under a perfect sheet of ice, silver in the moonlight. We took up our positions among the skeletal trees that fringed the Serpentine. The scene was unearthly. Gas lamps reduced to pale spheres, the bare branches laced with frost, and upon the ice itself a single set of footprints leading outward from the shore, narrow, elegant, a woman's. Minutes passed, 10, 20. The cold bit through our coats and numbed our fingers upon the revolver butts. Then from the direction of the Marble Arch came the soft crunch of cautious feet. Captain Trevorrow stepped out of the fog. He wore the same astrakhan coat, but now it was unbuttoned, and beneath it gleamed the scarlet of his old regimental mess jacket, defiant, almost theatrical. In his right hand he carried a cavalry saber, its blade catching the moonlight like a shard of ice. His face was gaunt, the eyes burning with the light of a man who has passed beyond fear. "Evelyn!" he called, and his voice carried across the frozen water with terrible clarity. "Come out. I know you are there. The money and the emerald, now, or I drag your name through every court in England before I kill you." Lady Langley stepped from the shelter of the trees and walked slowly onto the ice. The white cloak made her a ghost against the silver. She stopped 20 yards from him, motionless. Trevorrow laughed, a short, dreadful sound. "You thought to trap me with your detective, but I am done with hiding. The emerald is mine by right. The old thief stole it, and the curse passes down the blood. Give it to me." He began to walk toward her, the saber held low. Holmes touched my arm. We moved silently onto the ice behind him, spreading apart. Lady Langley raised her hand. In it blazed the true emerald restored to her by her husband from his hospital bed. "You want this?" she called, her voice steady. "Then take it, if you dare." She hurled the stone high into the air. It flashed green fire once against the moon and fell with a faint crystalline chime onto the ice between them. Trevorrow sprang forward with a snarl. At that instant, Holmes shouted, "Now, Watson!" We rushed in. Trevorrow whirled, saber flashing, but the ice betrayed him. His foot slipped on the frozen camellia that Lady Langley had let fall a moment earlier, deliberately as Violet Hunter had taught her. He staggered, arms windmilling for balance, and in that second of helplessness, Holmes struck the saber from his hand with his stick. It rang across the ice and vanished through a hole where the icebreakers had been at work. I covered him with my revolver. "It is finished, Trevorrow," said Holmes coldly. "The game is up." The captain stood swaying, breath steaming in the moonlight. For a moment I thought he would fight barehanded, but something in Holmes's eyes, the utter certainty of defeat, broke him. His shoulders sagged. "So be it," he said hoarsely. "But the curse remains. The emerald will destroy you all as it has destroyed us." He reached inside his mess jacket. I raised the revolver, but Holmes knocked it up. "No need," he said quietly. Trevorrow drew out not a weapon but a small glass vial. He held it to the moonlight, colorless liquid, and even at 10 paces I caught the faint, dreadful sweetness of bitter almonds. "A soldier's privilege," he said, and drank. He was dead before he struck the ice, his eyes fixed upon the green stone that lay glittering between us like a drop of frozen poison. Lady Langley sank to her knees, sobbing. Holmes picked up the emerald, wrapped it in his handkerchief, and stood for a long moment gazing down at the body. 8. The Ice House. The body of Captain Ralph Trevorrow was carried away at dawn, wrapped in a police tarpaulin and laid upon a coster's barrow. For no proper hearse would venture out on the icy roads. The emerald, now wrapped in cotton wool and sealed in a small tin box, rested in Holmes's breast pocket. He had refused to let it out of his sight until it could be returned to its rightful owner. Lady Langley had been taken home in a closed carriage, half fainting, and I had given her a strong sedative. London woke to another day of iron frost, yet the spell was broken. The snow no longer seemed a shroud, but merely weather. Holmes, however, was not satisfied. "There is a loose thread," he said as we breakfasted at 10 upon eggs and strong coffee. "Trevorrow is dead by his own hand. Lord Arthur lives, the emerald is recovered. Yet something gnaws at me. The corpse at Richmond, the false Lord Arthur, has never been claimed, and Lestrade is content to call the case closed. I am not." He pushed aside his plate. "Finish quickly, Watson. We are going back to the ice house. I have obtained the key from the Langley steward, and the police guard has been withdrawn. There is a question I must ask of the darkness itself." The river had frozen harder than ever during the night. Great plates of ice ground together with sullen groans, and the air was so cold it seemed to burn the lungs. We took the train to Richmond and walked the last mile along the towpath, our boots crunching through the wind-scoured snow. The ice house squatted upon the bank like some ancient barrow, its domed roof white, its iron-bound door hanging open exactly as we had left it. Inside, the cold struck us anew, a cold that belonged to the grave. The lantern threw long, wavering shadows across the glittering walls of ice. In the center, the great hook still swung gently from its chain, and upon the floor lay the severed ropes that had bound Lord Arthur. A dark stain marked where Trevorrow had fallen in his death struggle, though whether the stain was his blood or his brother's I could not tell. Holmes moved slowly, the lantern held high. He examined the ropes, the hook, the scattered straw that had been meant to receive the body when life finally ebbed. Then he knelt and began to brush the frost from the floor with his gloved hand. "Help me here, Watson." Together we cleared a space some 6 feet square. Beneath the frost, the packed sawdust of a century was revealed, and in the sawdust a shallow rectangular depression. "A man's body lay here," said Holmes, measuring with his tape. "But not for long. Observe the edges. Sharp, undisturbed. The corpse was removed within hours of being placed here." He rose and began to tap the walls of ice with the handle of his stick. At the third blow, the note changed from solid thud to hollow ring. "A cavity," he said. "Cut away the block above it." I seized the ice axe the steward had provided and attacked the wall. The ice was Norwegian, hard as granite, but after 10 minutes a block the size of a tea chest came free and crashed to the floor. Behind it was darkness, and a smell, faint but unmistakable, of corruption held in suspension by the cold. Holmes reached in with the lantern. Wedged into the narrow space between 2 great blocks lay a second body. A man in evening dress, arms bound behind him, a gag of silk still knotted about the mouth. The face was blackened and distorted, yet even through the ruin of frostbite I recognized the features. "Captain Ralph Trevorrow," I said, staggered. "But we saw him die upon the Serpentine not 6 hours ago." "No," said Holmes quietly. "We saw his twin." He reached in and drew from the dead man's clenched teeth a folded paper. Upon it, in the same coarse capitals we knew so well, were the words, "The curse is not so easily cheated. This one for that one. The emerald is mine." Holmes's eyes glittered in the lantern light. "Ralph and Rupert Trevorrow," he said. "Twin brothers, born 1861 in Simla. Ralph the soldier, cashiered for poisoning. Rupert the wastrel, sent down from Oxford for cheating at cards. Later transported for forgery in 89 and reported drowned off the Andaman Islands in 93. Evidently the report was premature. Rupert returned to England secretly, the perfect shadow for his brother to hide behind." He pointed to the corpse. "This is Ralph, the real Ralph, who planned everything. Rupert impersonated him when necessary, wore his clothes, smoked his Trichinopoly cigars, even carried his scent of bitter almonds. On the night Lord Arthur was taken, Rupert played the part of the pursuing woman in Stolen Boots. Later, when we surprised them at the ice house, Ralph was already dead, poisoned by his own brother to prevent him talking if captured. Rupert drank the cyanide on the serpentine to preserve the illusion that the villain was destroyed. I stared at the frozen corpse, horror creeping over me. Then the man we fought was Rupert, the greater villain of the two. He intended to vanish abroad with the emerald and the 20,000 pounds, leaving us to mourn a suicide and close the case. The twins shared everything, even their crimes. Holmes turned to the hook where Lord Arthur had hung. Lord Arthur was never meant to leave this place alive. When Rupert found him gone, rescued by us, he improvised the drama on the ice, trusting the curse and the confusion to cover his escape. But he overlooked one detail. He reached up and unhooked from the beam a small object tied with twine, a gentleman's gold cufflink, identical to the blood-stained one sent to Lady Langley. "The mate to the first," said Holmes. Rupert intended to stage a second ransom note, perhaps a second corpse. He had not yet decided, but the cold preserved his brother's body perfectly, and now it has betrayed him. He stood in silence for a long moment, the lantern casting his shadow huge and wavering across the ice. "Two brothers," he said at last, "bound by blood and divided by greed. One poisoned the other to keep a secret. The second poisoned himself to keep a curse alive. And between them they very nearly destroyed an innocent man and his wife." He turned toward the door. "Come, Watson. The ice house has yielded all its dead. Let Lestrade have this one too, and let the river take back its own." We stepped out into the pale winter sunshine. Behind us the door swung shut upon the darkness, and the frost began its slow work of sealing the entrance once more. Somewhere in the distance a train whistle sounded, thin and mournful, across the frozen water. Holmes paused upon the bank and looked back at the low dome. "There is a moral here," he said quietly, "though I mislike moralizing. The coldest place in England is not this ice house, nor the snow upon the ground. It is the human heart when greed and hatred dwell there together." He slipped the cufflink into his pocket beside the emerald. "Let us go home. Lord Arthur will want his property restored, and Lady Langley deserves to know that the last shadow has been lifted from her house." 9. The return of Captain Trevorrow. The thaw came at last, sudden and pitiless. On the morning of the 22nd of December, the wind swung round to the south, and by noon the gutters ran like rivers. Snow slid from the roofs in great wet avalanches. Icicles fell from the lampposts with the crash of broken glass. London seemed to exhale a long, steaming breath of relief. In Baker Street, the area steps became waterfalls, and Mrs. Hudson's boy was kept busy sweeping slush from the hall. Holmes had spent the previous day in his dressing gown, writing letters, burning papers, and playing the most melancholy airs upon his violin. He had returned the emerald to Lord Arthur in person, received a check for a sum that made even me blink, and declared the case closed. Yet I knew him too well. The restless glitter in his eyes told me that one thread still trailed. It was 4 o'clock and the short winter day already dying, when the bell rang with unusual violence. Mrs. Hudson appeared, pink with indignation. "There's a gentleman below, Mr. Holmes, and he will take no refusal. Says his name is Captain Trevorrow, and that you'll see him if you know what's good for you." Holmes's eyebrows shot up. He laid aside his violin. "Show Captain Trevorrow up at once, Mrs. Hudson, and Watson, your revolver, if you please." A moment later the door opened to admit a tall figure in a heavy ulster, hat pulled low and muffler about the lower face. The man closed the door behind him with deliberate care, turned the key in the lock, and only then threw back the muffler. The face was that of Captain Ralph Trevorrow, bronzed, scarred, defiant. the same face that had stared up at us dead upon the ice of the Serpentine. I half rose, revolver in hand, but Holmes motioned me down. "Pray be seated, Mr. Rupert Trevorrow," he said calmly. "Your performance the other night was admirable, but the game is over." The man gave a short, harsh laugh and dropped into the basket chair. "So you know," he said. His voice was identical to his dead brother's, the same clipped cavalry drawl. "I wondered which of us you had found in the ice house." "Both," replied Holmes, "the living and the dead. You played your parts to perfection, but twins always leave traces. The scar upon the left temple, Ralph received his at Kandahar. Yours is upon the right, though you disguised it with the mustache. The slight difference in the set of the shoulders. Ralph was left-handed, you are not. And above all, the camellia. Ralph detested flowers. You cultivated them in the prison hothouse at Port Blair. I found the crushed petal upon the Serpentine still bearing the faint scar of the Andaman convict brand upon your thumb." Rupert Trevorrow's eyes narrowed to slits. "Clever?" he said. "Too clever by half. But you'll never take me alive, Holmes. The emerald is already on its way to Amsterdam, and I sail tonight. I came only to settle one small account." He reached slowly inside his ulster. I raised the revolver, but Holmes again checked me. "You will find the emerald in the left-hand drawer of my desk," said Holmes quietly. "Wrapped in cotton wool and sealed with Scotland Yard wax. The courier was one of Lestrade's men in disguise. As for sailing tonight, every port officer from Tilbury to Southampton has your description, and the Andaman brand is difficult to hide when one is stripped for medical examination." Trevorrow's hand came out empty. For a moment he sat motionless, the last of his arrogance draining away. "Then it was all for nothing," he said at last. "Ralph dead, myself taken, the stone lost. The old priest was right. The emerald brings winter to whoever touches it." He laughed again, a dreadful hollow sound. "My brother planned the perfect crime, and I perfected it. We took turns being each other for 20 years. When Ralph was cashiered, I took his place at the club. When I was transported, he visited me as himself and arranged my death. We returned to England together, invisible. The ransom, the forged letters, the ice house, all Ralph's idea. But when you rescued Arthur, Ralph panicked. He wanted to confess, to bargain. I could not allow that. So I gave him his own medicine, a soldier's death, swift and clean. Then I played the last act alone." He looked at Holmes with something almost like admiration. "You have beaten us, Mr. Holmes, but tell me one thing. When did you first suspect two?" Holmes leaned forward, his thin fingers clasped about his knee. "From the moment the footprints in Grosvenor Square showed a woman pursuing Lord Arthur. No woman could have overpowered him. A man in woman's boots, yes. Later, the camellia stained with blood upon the balcony. Ralph would never have carried a flower. You left it as a signature. And finally, the ice house. The ropes that bound Lord Arthur had been cut with a left-handed stroke. Yet the man who fought us there was right-handed. 2 men, 1 crime." Trevorrow nodded slowly. "And now I hang, I suppose, or rot again in the Andamans." "Transportation for life," said Holmes. "The noose was abolished for all but treason and murder of a spouse. You poisoned your brother, but the law will call it manslaughter, a crime of passion among gentlemen or some such nonsense. You will see palm trees again, Mr. Trevorrow." The man rose, drawing the muffler about his face once more. "Then I have nothing left to lose." He moved with astonishing speed. Before I could bring the revolver to bear, he had hurled himself not at us but at the window. The glass shattered outward in a shower of shards. For one awful second he hung framed against the darkening sky, then dropped like a stone. We rushed to the sill. 17 feet below, upon the wet pavement, lay the body, motionless, a dark stain spreading beneath the head. Holmes stood looking down for a long moment. "The last act," he said softly. "He chose his own curtain." Mrs. Hudson's scream echoed up the stairwell. Already a knot of people was gathering in the slushy street. Somewhere a policeman's whistle shrilled. Holmes turned away from the window. "Two brothers," he murmured, "and neither would let the other live without the emerald. In the end, they destroyed each other and very nearly an innocent family with them. The snow has melted, Watson, and the ice house is empty. Let us draw the curtains and light the lamp. The year is dying, but life goes on." He picked up his violin and began to play, a slow, wistful air that seemed to carry within it all the sorrow of the long winter. Outside, the lamps were being lit one by one, and London, steaming and dripping, prepared for Christmas, while the blood of the last Trevorrow mingled with the melting snow and ran away into the gutters of Baker Street. 10. The final deduction. The 24th of December dawned mild and dripping. London had put on its familiar mantle of soot and yellow fog. Only the blackened heaps at the street corners and the occasional avalanche of slush from a passing omnibus reminded one that a week earlier the city had lain in the grip of the hardest frost in 30 years. In Baker Street, the lamps were already lit at noon, and the air carried the faint, comforting scent of chestnuts roasting on a brazier. Holmes had insisted that the final explanation be given in Grosvenor Square itself. Lord Arthur, though still weak and swathed in shawls, had risen from his sick bed and now sat beside the library fire, his hand clasped in that of his wife. Lady Langley, pale but composed, wore the Langley emerald at her throat for the first time in years. The great stone blazed with cold green fire against the black of her mourning. Lestrade occupied a straight-backed chair near the door, notebook upon knee, trying without success to look as though he had expected everything. Holmes stood before the mantel beneath the portrait of the fierce old colonel who had begun the whole tragic tale in a temple beside the Kashmir snows. "Pray compose yourselves," Holmes began, in the quiet, precise voice he reserved for such moments. "What follows is painful, but it is the truth. And truth is the only physician who can heal the wounds this affair has inflicted." He took from his pocket the blood-stained cuff-link and laid it upon the table beside its fellow, the one recovered from the ice-house beam. "Two links, two brothers, one crime. Let us go back to the beginning. Ralph and Rupert Trevorrow were born twins in Simla in 1861. From childhood they were interchangeable. Same height, same voice, same ruthless ambition. Where one ended and the other began, even their mother could not always tell. Ralph took the army path, Rupert the university, and disgrace followed both. Ralph poisoned a brother officer who discovered his card sharping. Rupert forged college bills and was transported. Yet blood proved thicker than empire. Ralph arranged his twin's death in the Andamans. Rupert returned secretly to England. From that moment they became a single perfect criminal, appearing now as one man, now as another, never together in public, yet always in concert. They learned of the Langley financial ruin and conceived a plan that should satisfy both vengeance and greed. The emerald, they knew, was the only asset left. Months before the abduction, they substituted a paste copy, Rupert's work, Vienna-cut glass of the finest quality. Lord Arthur, examining the stone only in its case, noticed nothing. The substitution was complete. Then began the campaign of terror. Forged letters in Lady Langley's hand convinced Lord Arthur that his wife planned to elope and sell the jewel. On the night of the 14th of December, a final note, again in her copied script, bade him meet her in the garden at midnight with the emerald, or lose everything to scandal. Half mad with jealousy, he obeyed. Rupert, wearing Lady Langley's discarded evening boots, followed to lend authenticity to the pursuer's footprints. In the square, a closed carriage waited. Lord Arthur was overpowered, bound, and carried to the old ice house on the Thames, a place the brothers knew from boyhood summers. There Ralph intended a death exquisitely cruel, slow freezing with the true emerald placed in the victim's hand, so that when the body was found it would seem Lord Arthur had taken his own life clutching the jewel he meant to sell. Meanwhile Rupert, impersonating Ralph, paid courteous visits to Grosvenor Square to watch the anguish at first hand. But I appeared upon the scene sooner than they expected. The ransom note, delivered before they were ready, forced improvisation. The cufflink and blood were genuine, taken from Lord Arthur during the struggle. The corpse in the Thames was a wretched former soldier named Merritt, poisoned with injected prussic acid and dressed in Lord Arthur's clothes. The twins hoped the frozen body would be accepted as his lordship's, closing the case and allowing them to vanish abroad with £20,000 withdrawn under threat days earlier. When we rescued Lord Arthur from the ice house, Ralph panicked and threatened confession. Rupert silenced him forever with his own poison, hid the body in the ice, and continued the impersonation. On the Serpentine, he staged a suicide, believing the death of Captain Trevorrow would end pursuit. He overlooked the tiny differences that betray even perfect twins to close observation. Yesterday he returned here to this house, hoping to recover the emerald before fleeing. He found instead Lestrade's men waiting. Rather than face transportation again, he chose the 17-foot drop from our window. The Trevorrow brothers are reunited at last, in death, as they were in life. Holmes paused. The library was very still. Only the crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of a cab in the square broke the silence. Lord Arthur stirred. "But why such hatred?" he asked hoarsely. "I had done them no injury." Holmes turned to the portrait above the mantel. "Your grandfather took the emerald by force from a temple in Kashmir. The priest cursed not only the thief, but his blood. The Trevorrows, through a Hindu nurse in their childhood, learned the legend and believed themselves the instruments of that curse. Greed and superstition, a deadly combination." Lady Langley touched the stone at her throat. "And now," she whispered. Holmes smiled, the rare, gentle smile that transformed his austere face. "Now, madam, the curse is broken. The emerald returns to its rightful owners who have paid dearly for the sins of their forebears. I suggest you present it to the British Museum with the full history attached. Sunlight is the best exorcism for old shadows." Lord Arthur rose, leaning heavily upon his stick. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I owe you my life, my wife's happiness, my name. The check I gave you is laughably inadequate." Holmes waved the words away. "I have my reward. The problem was unique. Its solution will illuminate several obscure points in the literature of crime. And I have the satisfaction of knowing that love, misunderstood, betrayed, yet enduring, proved stronger than hatred in the end." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One last thing. The white camellias. Plant them no more in this house. They belong to a darker garden than yours." Outside, the fog was lifting. A watery sun struck through the yellow haze and touched the emerald to a sudden blaze of green fire as Lord Arthur opened the library safe for the last time. Somewhere in the square a band of waits began to play "God Rest Ye Merry, Gentlemen," thin and reedy but full of the promise of Christmas. Holmes drew on his gloves. "Come, Watson. Mrs. Hudson will have kept the goose hot these 2 hours. The year dies, the snow melts, and life, stubborn, foolish, indestructible life, goes on. Let us drink to that, and to the hope that the next puzzle that comes our way may be warmed by a kinder fire than the one we have just left." We stepped out into the slushy street. Behind us, the door of number 47 closed upon a house that had looked into the abyss and stepped back. Ahead lay Baker Street, lamplight, tobacco, and the comfortable certainty that whatever horrors the future might hold, Sherlock Holmes would be there, lean, eager, indomitable, ready to confront them.